Atlanta, attracting celebs like 50 Cent and Trey Songz. But neighbors, they're not having a good time. That's because of noise and disruption.
Party promoters turning mansions into wild party scenes, and now the city says it's actually stepping in to try to stop that problem.
Behind the rusted iron gates of 1011 Garmon Road lies a ghost. Once the $8.5 million crown jewel of country legend Kenny Rogers, this Atlanta mega mansion was the peak of Southern elegance. But the music stopped, the owners fled, and a party mansion emerged from the shadows. Today, gold-leafed ceilings crumble over empty bottles and shattered dreams. This isn't just a house, it's a cautionary tale of fame, fraud, and a legendary gambler whose luck finally ran out. A mansion abandoned. The reality of this massive million-dollar estate is far more clinical and legally complex. The truth is that this mansion didn't just lose its pulse. It was systematically hollowed out by a series of legal maneuvers, federal investigations, and a disappearing act that would rival a Hollywood thriller. The first misconception to clear up is the role of the man whose name is still etched into the property's legacy, Kenny Rogers. To be blunt, Kenny Rogers did not abandon this house. He didn't lose it in a bet, and he didn't flee from it in the middle of the night. Rogers lived there during his golden years, eventually selling the property in 2006 for a staggering $8.5 million. He walked away with a check and his dignity intact. The abandonment didn't begin with the country star. It began with the people who thought they could fill his shoes. The house was purchased by a prominent Nigerian couple, Dr. Oladayo Oluyi and her husband. At the time, they were the picture of the American dream, a high-flying dermatologist and an enterprising businessman who wanted the most recognizable zip code in Atlanta. For a decade, the home remained a private fortress, but behind the scenes, the finances were a house of cards. By 2018, the dream had curdled into a federal nightmare. The owners became the subjects of intense scrutiny involving medical billing fraud and staggering unpaid tax liens. When the legal heat became too much to bear, they didn't just move out. They reportedly fled the country, leaving the massive estate to face the elements and the taxman alone. This is the moment the mansion transitioned from a home to a zombie property. It was legally owned but practically orphaned. Because the owners were overseas and entangled in litigation, the house fell into a jurisdictional no-man's land. During this period of limbo, the abandonment became a physical reality. Without a staff to maintain the complex climate control systems, the Georgia humidity began to eat at the drywall. Without a landscaper, the manicured lawns turned into a jungle that obscured the view from the street. But most importantly, without a resident, the house became a target. It wasn't just the wind rattling the windows, it was the sound of a new, illicit era beginning. The bank eventually stepped in, but foreclosure on an $8.5 million estate with international owners and federal liens is a slow, agonizing process. For years, the house sat in a state of suspended animation. It was empty, yes. It was decaying, certainly. But abandoned is a term of neglect. And this house was being watched by more than just the bank. It was being watched by promoters, squatters, and filmmakers who saw the vacancy as an opportunity. The truth of the matter is that 1011 Garmon Road was never truly forgotten. It was simply left unguarded, and in a city like Atlanta, an unguarded palace is an invitation for chaos. This section of its life wasn't a quiet ending, but a loud, messy middle chapter that would soon turn the gambler's sanctuary into the most hated house in the neighborhood. But before the walls began to weep with mold and the marble floors were scuffed by the boots of trespassers, this house was a masterpiece of intentional, unapologetic luxury, the ultimate trophy of a man who had bet on himself and won. The Gambler's Palace, 1990 to 2006. To understand the magnitude of the mansion's fall, one must first understand the height from which it tumbled. In 1990, Kenny Rogers was more than just a country singer. He was a global brand, a silver-bearded icon of crossover success who embodied a specific kind of American aspirational wealth. When he broke ground on the estate at 1011 Garmon Road in the heart of Atlanta's prestigious Buckhead district, he wasn't just building a roof over his head. He was building a monument to his career. This was the era of the gambler, and Rogers wanted a home that looked like a winning hand. The construction was an ambitious undertaking that spared no expense. Sprawling across nearly 5 acres of prime Georgia real estate, the 15,000-square-foot Mediterranean-style villa was designed to be a fortress of privacy and a theater for entertaining. Rogers was deeply involved in the design, insisting on features that reflected the old-world opulence he admired. The entrance was dominated by a massive rotunda, a soaring circular foyer that served as the spine of the house. From this central point, the home fanned out into a labyrinth of 20 rooms, including 5 massive bedrooms and 6 full baths. The interior was a masterclass in the aesthetics of the 90s elite. There were hand-carved moldings, gold leaf accents, and expansive floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the ivory walls in natural light. But the true centerpiece was the master suite. It wasn't just a bedroom, it was a sanctuary. It featured a Roman-style spa, complete with sunken tubs and Corinthian columns, evoking the feel of a private bathhouse in ancient Italy. For Rogers, this wasn't just luxury. It was a retreat from the grueling life of a touring musician. Here, behind the high gates, the noise of the world disappeared. Outside, the grounds were a testament to the old-money Buckhead aesthetic. The landscaping was surgical in its precision. Manicured boxwoods, hidden stone pathways, and a sparkling pool area made the estate feel like a 5-star resort. There was a tennis court where Rogers, an avid player, spent his mornings, and a guest house that saw a revolving door of Nashville royalty and Hollywood elite. During these 16 years, the house was alive. It smelled of expensive cigars and high-end catering. It was a place of order, prestige, and quiet power. In the context of the neighborhood, the Rogers estate was the gold standard. Buckhead has always been Atlanta's answer to Beverly Hills, a place where old Southern families and new money celebrities coexist in a delicate social dance. By building such a massive, tasteful estate, Rogers cemented his status as a pillar of the community. He wasn't just a celebrity passing through. He was a resident who contributed to the area's aura of untouchable wealth. However, there is a certain irony in the design of 1011 Garmon Road. Rogers built it with a more is more philosophy. Massive rooms, towering ceilings, and intricate systems that required a small army to maintain. It was a house designed for a king, but kings eventually move on. In 2006, after 16 years of hosting gala dinners and private concerts, Rogers decided it was time for a change. He put the house on the market, eventually finding buyers who seemed to match the home's grandeur. When Kenny Rogers handed over the keys, he wasn't just selling real estate, he was transferring a legacy. He left behind a home that was in pristine, turnkey condition, a palace that still hummed with the energy of his success. At the time of the sale, no one could have predicted that the Roman spa would one day be filled with stagnant water, or that the rotunda would echo with the bass of illegal parties. The transition seemed seamless, a simple passing of the torch from one wealthy family to another. But as the moving trucks pulled away and the gambler headed for his next venture, the spirit of the house began to shift. The era of refinement was over, and the era of the party mansion was waiting just beyond the horizon. The changing of the guard. The year 2006 marked a pivotal shift for 1011 Garmon Road. As Kenny Rogers prepared to move on to a more manageable lifestyle in Sandy Springs, the keys were handed over to a pair of ambitious professionals, Yinka Adesokan, and his wife, Dr. Paula Nelson. On paper, it was a match made in real estate heaven. They were a power couple within Atlanta's thriving Nigerian-American community, having built an empire of dermatology clinics called Family Dermatology. For $1 million, one of the highest residential sales in the city at the time, they purchased not just a home, but a throne. For a few years, the transition seemed to reinforce the home's status. The new owners maintained the property's grandeur, filling the halls with their own successes. In a neighborhood like Buckhead, where your home is your resume, the Adesokan Nelson family had the ultimate credential. They were living the pinnacle of the immigrant success story. operating dozens of medical practices across multiple states. However, while the exterior of the mansion remained polished, the foundation of the owner's business empire was beginning to fracture under the weight of federal scrutiny. The changing of the guard wasn't just a change in residence, it was a shift in the home's energy. Under Rogers, the mansion was a fortress of country music royalty, private, quiet, and deliberate. Under the new owners, the estate became a symbol of a more aggressive, fast-moving kind of wealth. But as the 2010s progressed, the old-world luxury of the mansion began to clash with the new-world legal troubles facing its inhabitants. Rumors began to swirl about the stability of the family dermatology empire. What seemed like a booming medical practice was actually being flagged by the Department of Justice. The couple was eventually hit with massive fines and civil judgments for double billing, charging both patients and insurance companies for the same procedures. The legal fees and penalties began to mount, and by the time the IRS showed up with a $6.5 million lien for unpaid taxes, the writing was on the wall. The guard had changed, but the new sentries were under siege. In 2018, the situation reached a breaking point. Facing a mountain of debt and the looming threat of federal prosecution, the couple reportedly made a choice that changed the history of the property forever. They left. They didn't just move to a smaller house. They reportedly fled the country entirely, heading back to Nigeria and leaving their $8.5 million investment to fend for itself. It was the moment the mansion's light truly went out, leaving the neighborhood to wonder how a palace of such stature could suddenly become a massive, echoing void. The departure of the owners turned the mansion into an expensive ghost ship. But the silence wouldn't last long, because in a city that never stops moving, an empty palace is a gold mine for those who know how to exploit a vacuum. The federal shadow, when the gates of 1011 Garmon Road finally clicked shut behind the departing Nigerian owners, the mansion didn't just become empty, it became a ghost ship. In maritime law, a ghost ship is a vessel found drifting at sea with no living crew, its destination unknown, and its purpose lost. By 2018, this was the exact state of the Rogers estate. The owners, Dr. Paula Nelson and Adeyinka Adesokan, had reportedly vanished across the Atlantic, leaving a trail of paperwork that would take federal investigators years to untangle. This wasn't a standard move. It was a tactical retreat from a tightening noose of federal scrutiny. The shadow hanging over the property was cast by the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Justice. The primary blow came from the couple's business, family dermatology. Federal authorities alleged a massive scheme of upcoding and double billing, where the practice systematically overcharged insurance providers and the government for medical procedures. The fallout was catastrophic. A federal judge eventually ordered the couple to pay back millions of dollars in civil judgments. Simultaneously, the IRS slapped the property with a $6.5 million tax lien. For the first time in its history, the house wasn't an asset. It was a liability of gargantuan proportions. This legal entanglement created a strange, haunting vacuum. Under normal circumstances, if a homeowner fails to pay their bills, the bank moves in within months to reclaim and resell the property. But 1011 Garmon Road was different. Because of the international nature of the owner's departure and the complexity of the federal liens, the foreclosure process ground to a halt. The house sat in a state of jurisdictional paralysis. No one had the authority to sell it, yet no one was there to inhabit it. The IRS had a claim, the mortgage lender had a claim, and the city of Atlanta had a claim for unpaid property taxes, but none of them had the keys. During this period of the shadow, the mansion began its physical transformation into the ruin we see in viral videos today. Without a resident to fight back the Georgia climate, the house began to consume itself. The massive HVAC systems, designed to keep the humidity away from the gold-leafed ceilings and delicate wood, failed. Condensation began to settle on the walls, leading to the first blooms of black mold. The sparkling pool, once the crown jewel of the backyard, stopped circulating. Within a single season, the water turned from azure to a thick pea soup green, becoming a breeding ground for mosquitoes and a visual marker of the estate's abandonment. Yet, as the legal battle raged in courtrooms miles away, the ghost ship wasn't as empty as the neighbors hoped. The lack of a clear owner meant there was no one to call the police for trespassing until it was too late. Squatters weren't the first to arrive. It was the vultures of the modern age, urban explorers and opportunistic looters. They found gaps in the perimeter and unlocked service doors. They walked through the rotunda where Kenny Rogers once stood, now filming the decay for likes and views. The federal shadow had turned a private sanctuary into a public spectacle, and the world was watching the slow-motion collapse of an $8.5 million dream. The most tragic irony of this era was the house's reputation. In the eyes of the law, it was a crime scene of financial fraud. In the eyes of the bank, it was a bad debt. But in the eyes of the neighborhood, it was a ticking time bomb. The silence of the federal shadow was eerie, but it was merely the calm before the storm. Because while the owners were gone, a new group of inhabitants was about to move in, not to live in the house, but to burn its reputation to the ground in a series of neon-lit, bass-heavy nights that would make the gambler roll in his grave. The quiet of the federal investigation was soon shattered by the roar of high-performance engines and the thumping bass of Atlanta's underground, as the mansion was reborn as the city's most notorious and illegal nightclub. The Ric Flair Drip era. The transition from a federal ghost ship to a pulsating epicenter of Atlanta's hip-hop subculture happened almost overnight. While the courts were arguing over tax liens, the mansion was being hijacked by the very thing it was built to exclude: the loud, unfiltered chaos of the world outside. Between 2018 and 2019, 1011 Garmon Road became the Party Mansion, a name that still triggers a collective shudder from the residents of Buckhead. It was a period of lawlessness that saw the estate rebranded from a country music sanctuary to a neon-lit backdrop for some of the biggest names in the music industry. The catalyst for this transformation was a loophole in the mansion's abandonment. With the owners in Nigeria and the bank moving at a glacial pace, a group of event promoters essentially occupied the vacuum. They didn't just squat, they monetized. They began renting out the crumbling estate for music videos and massive ticketed parties. Because there was no legal resident to sign a no trespassing order, the police found their hands tied. This wasn't just a few kids drinking beer on a porch. This was a commercial enterprise operating in the middle of a high-end residential neighborhood. The mansion's most famous moment of this era came when it served as the primary filming location for the Ric Flair Drip music video, featuring Offset, Metro Boomin, and the wrestling legend Ric Flair himself. In the video, the performers draped themselves across the very marble staircases Kenny Rogers once walked. They popped champagne in the kitchens and danced in the rotunda. To the millions of viewers online, the house looked like the ultimate symbol of trap wealth, a sprawling, opulent playground. But to anyone looking closely, the cracks were already showing. The grandeur was a prop, a fading stage set for a culture that thrived on the aesthetic of excess. Soon, the music videos weren't enough. The promoters began hosting mansion parties that became the stuff of local legend and neighborhood nightmares. On any given weekend, the quiet, tree-lined streets of Buckhead were choked with hundreds of luxury vehicles. Lamborghinis and Ferraris were parked haphazardly on the lawns of multi-million-dollar neighbors. There were reports of helicopters landing in the backyard and private security guards with semi-automatic rifles patrolling the perimeter. The bass from the sound systems was so powerful, it literally rattled the windows of the neighboring estates, some of which were hundreds of yards away. For the neighbors, life became a war zone. One neighbor famously kept a log of the incidents, reporting over 100 calls to the Atlanta Police Department in a single year. They described scenes of pure mayhem, intoxicated guests wandering onto their lawns, trash strewn across the streets, and the constant, thumping heartbeat of the parties that didn't stop until the sun came up. The contrast was jarring. This was a neighborhood where people paid millions for the privilege of silence, yet they were living next door to an unregulated nightclub that had more in common with a Las Vegas pool party than a residential home. The Party Mansion era was a masterclass in the exploitation of a dying asset. The promoters knew that the house was in foreclosure and that the legal system was too slow to stop them. They ran the property into the ground, profiting from the decay. While the guests were drinking and dancing, the house was suffering. The parties accelerated the physical decline of the interior. Floors were stained, walls were scuffed, and the delicate Mediterranean architecture was subjected to the wear and tear of thousands of feet. It was a period of high-octane disrespect for the history of the home. The crackdown finally came in late 2019. Under immense pressure from the Buckhead Council and outraged residents, the city of Atlanta finally found a way to intervene. They arrested the lead promoter and slapped the property with dozens of code violations. The bank, finally realizing that their asset was being destroyed from the inside out, tightened security. The music was silenced, the neon lights were cut, and the fleet of supercars disappeared as quickly as they had arrived. But when the smoke cleared and the party was over, what was left wasn't the mansion Kenny Rogers built. It was a bruised and battered shell of its former self. The Ric Flair drip had left a permanent stain. The house was now famous for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't the Kenny Rogers estate anymore, it was the party mansion. It had lost its dignity, and as the gates were finally locked with heavy chains, the house began its final, lonely descent into the true abandonment that urban explorers would eventually document for the world to see. With the music finally dead and the promoters behind bars, the mansion was left to the one thing it couldn't survive: the slow, silent rot of a Georgia summer. Anatomy of decay. Stepping through the threshold of 1011 Garmon Road today feels less like entering a home and more like entering a tomb for the American dream. The transition from the high-energy party mansion era to its current state of absolute stillness has been brutal. In the absence of life, the house has developed its own sensory language, one of peeling paint, stagnant air, and the rhythmic drip of water hitting marble. This is the anatomy of decay, a visceral look at what happens when an $8.5 million masterpiece is reclaimed by the earth. The first thing that hits you is the smell. It is a heavy, thick mixture of damp earth, old dust, and the cloyingly sweet scent of black mold. Without the hum of the industrial-grade HVAC system that Kenny Rogers once relied on, the Georgia humidity has become the master of the house. In the grand rotunda, the gold-leafed accents that once caught the morning sun are now flaking off like dead skin. The towering white columns, inspired by the majesty of ancient Rome, are streaked with green algae and dark moisture trails. The air feels weighted, as if the house itself is exhaling its final breaths. As you move toward the kitchen, once a state-of-the-art culinary center, the devastation is total. The high-end appliances, which once served gourmet meals to Nashville's elite, are now dull and covered in a fine layer of grime. Cabinet doors hang at awkward angles, their hinges rusted by the moisture. On the counters, you might still find a stray bottle of expensive champagne or a discarded red Solo cup, relics of the Ric Flair drip era that seem like artifacts from a lost civilization. The contrast between the inherent value of the materials, the granite, the fine woods, the custom tiling, and the utter filth covering them is a jarring reminder of how quickly luxury can turn to trash. The master suite, the crown jewel of Rogers' design, is perhaps the most heartbreaking room in the estate. The Roman-style spa, once a shimmering oasis of relaxation, now looks like something out of a horror film. The sunken tub is filled with a shallow pool of black, oily water and fallen plaster from the ceiling. The Corinthian columns that surround the bath are cracked, and the mirrors are so clouded with oxidation that they no longer reflect the room, only a distorted gray shadow of what it used to be. It is a space designed for the ultimate comfort, now offering only the ultimate unease. Outside, the decay is even more aggressive. The backyard, which once hosted tennis matches and pristine garden parties, has been swallowed by the Georgia forest. The manicured lawn is gone, replaced by waist-high weeds and invasive vines that have begun to claw their way up the Mediterranean stucco walls. But it is the pool that remains the most haunting visual of the abandonment. It is a massive, rectangular void of pea soup-colored water, thick with rot and floating debris. The stone pathways are cracked by the roots of trees that were never meant to grow there. The house is being strangled by its own landscape. In this state of ruin, the mansion has become a playground for urban explorers and vulture photographers. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the Kenny Rogers brand that still lingers in the architecture. They document the shattered windows and the graffiti scrawled on the ivory walls, modern scars on an old soul. Every broken tile and every water-damaged ceiling joist tells the story of a house that was loved, then used, and finally discarded. The anatomy of this decay isn't just about physical rot. It's about the loss of purpose. A house this big was never meant to be silent, and in its silence, the decay feels loud. As the vines continue their slow climb toward the roofline, the mansion stands as a grim monument to the fact that even the greatest empires are only a few years of neglect away from being reclaimed by the wild. The legend of the gambler's luck. In the twilight of his life, Kenny Rogers famously sang that every gambler knows that the secret to surviving is knowing what to throw away and knowing what to keep. As the mansion at 1011 Garmon Road stands in its current state of ruin, those lyrics feel less like a song and more like a prophecy. There is a profound, almost poetic irony in the fact that the man who built his brand on the wisdom of knowing when to fold 'em managed to exit this property at the absolute peak of its value, leaving the subsequent wreckage to those who lacked his timing. The story of this house is a modern American fable about the transient nature of wealth. We tend to view multi-million-dollar estates as permanent fixtures, monuments of stone and marble that will outlast the people who build them. But the Rogers estate proves that a house is only as stable as the life being lived inside it. When Rogers lived there, the house was a reflection of discipline, artistry, and a long-game approach to success. It was a kept thing. When the ownership shifted to a couple whose fortune was built on the shifting sands of fraud, the house transformed to match that energy, becoming a hollow, flashy stage for a party that was never meant to last. To walk through the ruins today is to witness the gambler's luck in reverse. The party mansion era was a desperate attempt to keep the lights on using the house as a prop, a final high-stakes bluff that eventually got called by the city and the banks. In the end, the house became the ultimate dead hand. It is a reminder that in the high-stakes game of legacy, you can't just buy a throne, you have to have the character to maintain it. Kenny Rogers moved on to a smaller, more graceful life, eventually passing away in 2020 in a well-loved home that reflected his final chapter. Meanwhile, his former masterpiece became a cautionary tale, a skeleton of a dream that serves as a warning to anyone who thinks that walls alone can preserve a reputation. The legend of 1011 Garmon Road isn't just about a singer or a scandal. It's about the silence that follows the roar. It teaches us that the most expensive thing you can own is a past you can no longer afford to maintain. As the wind whistles through the broken rotunda, it echoes a final lesson. The house always wins, but only if you know when to walk away. The final cards have been dealt, and as the dust settles on the marble floors of Buckhead's most notorious estate, we are left to wonder if anyone will ever have the luck or the courage to bet on this house again. If you want to see which legends rise and which palaces fall next, hit the subscribe button and join us as we uncover the secrets hidden behind the world's most famous gates.